so that everybody can successfully enter our room here. So some of you may see us, hopefully. So I think we are about to begin. So yeah, let me start anyway, because I'm just gonna introduce you very briefly. So good afternoon, or maybe good morning or good evening, everyone from all over the world. My name is Hee-Don at Konkuk University, and I'm currently president of Linguistic Society of Korea. And I'm very honored to moderate this session by monitoring and controlling your questions on the chat window during or after the presentation. So you can either post your questions on our chat window, or you can ask directly orally after his presentation. Today's speaker is Professor Jason Rothman, and he will give a talk on third language acquisition, which I'm also very much interested in. Jason was born in a suburb of New York City, and when he was 17, he engraved a tattoo on his inner right ankle, which said linguistics in Chinese. And now he's faithfully doing linguistics proper. Jason has begun to study linguistics and Romance languages at Cornell, and he did his MA and PhD in UCLA. He taught at Iowa, Florida, reading at UK, and now he's in Norway. So without further ado, please welcome Mr. Linguistics Tattoo.
Thank you very much. That's the greatest introduction I think I've ever received. And if I knew you'd say that, I would have taken a picture to show you all my tattoo. So it was a good thing that it worked out, actually, and that I dedicated myself. So first off, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here. Well, be here in these special times and in this special way. I would have much preferred, of course, to be with all of you. I've been there once and it was amazing. And I hope that when the world opens again, that potentially you'll consider to have me back, because it really was a wonderful experience. So today I'm going to talk about additive multilingualism. So indeed, third language acquisition. I'll get into that in a second. Obviously, multilingualism can take many shapes and forms, and I'm going to talk about a specific state of it, and that's when bilinguals attempt mastery of learning yet another language in adulthood. So without further ado, I will continue. So here's just a roadmap for today's talk. Bear with us 1 second. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so here's a roadmap for today's talk. Do you see? Yeah, okay, so hold on. Yeah, here's a roadmap for today's talk. Sorry, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so I have one of my postdocs is sitting beside me changing a screen, and we're not synchronized yet, but we're getting there. Okay, so but now I can see what you see. Okay, so today we're going to foreground who third language learners are, and then I'll give you a general background on third language issues. And then what I'm going to do for you is going to look at the emerging field, because it really is an emerging field looking at transfer in third language acquisition, specifically in morphosyntax. And I'm going to give you a research synthesis. These two things were recently published, one in a book, I'll show you the citations if you're interested, and the other in the journal Second Language Research. So I'll go through kind of a meta-analysis, really a systematic review of the field, and that's what we'll be doing today. Okay, so, but before I do that, I want you to kind of virtually raise your hands, and maybe I'll see some of you actually using those icons, if you definitely know what a third language learner is. So I'll interchangeably use the term additive multilingual learner, so a bilingual learning, yet a chronologically third language or third language. So just raise your hand if you know what a third language learner is. I'm not trying to trick anybody here. So if we can all count 1, 2, 3, in principle, we do know what a third language learner is. But who really qualifies as such within the research literature? Okay, so let's problematize this for a second. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you to keep track of 7 scenarios. Okay, I'm going to read for you 7 scenarios, and they're going to look very much like this. Okay, so there'll be 7 of them. What I'm going to ask you to do is, if you think this person qualifies, this description of this person qualifies as a third language learner, then you assign 1 point. Okay, you keep track of this however you want. You can either do it mentally. If you have a pen near you, you can make a hash or whatever. And when I'm finished with these 7 scenarios, if you think that all 7 of them are a type or a third language learner, then you'll have 7. If you only think it's 6 or 5 or 4, so on. And then we'll kind of think about potentially how and why we come up with either the same, all of us answers, which would be a first if that ever happens. And I've given similar presentations many times, or if indeed some of us as individuals might come up with different answers, even though we're asking the same question. And presumably most of us raised our hands to the question that you definitely knew what a third language learner is. Okay, so Matteo is from the Netherlands and his father is as well, but his mother's from Italy. He's a naturalistic, simultaneous bilingual of Dutch and Italian, seemingly balanced from childhood. Now in school, he's relatively young. You can see in his picture, he is learning a third language. Is Matteo a third language learner? If yes, you have 1. If not, you still have 0. Brendan is from Jamaica. He speaks Jamaican English as his native language, but also speaks standard English equally well. And for those of you who don't necessarily know, there are significant differences between English, Jamaican English, very different from, say, my native dialect of the suburbs of New York City to what I'm speaking to you now, which is a much more standard version of English. He's now exposed, he was not exposed to patois as a child. So this is a Spanish, English, and Dutch-based Creole that's spoken, but is now learning it in college. Is he a third language learner? Tamar lives in Ottawa, and although his first languages were Tamil and English, his parents being from India, he has taken French since he was 6. Now as an adult, he is taking German in college. Is Tamar a third language learner? Mireia was raised in Seville, but her family is from Barcelona. She learned Spanish as a first language and was exposed to Catalan in her home at a very early age. She can understand Catalan pretty well, but never speaks it. And now as a teenager, she's learning English in school. Is Mireia a third language learner? You can have a total of 4, okay? Ping is a native Mandarin speaker from Beijing. He moved to Austria when he was 9 and became dominant in German. At the age of 14, in anticipation of moving back to Beijing, his parents enrolled him in an intensive Mandarin bilingual school so he would learn Mandarin again before moving back home. Is he a type of third language learner? Jennifer's from Pennsylvania. She started learning Spanish at age 14 and was successful. Later in college, she majored in Spanish and began to take Portuguese, although this was a long time ago. Is Jennifer a third language learner? And finally, Ana Lucia is from Portugal. She took English since she was in 2nd grade and turned out to be very successful. At 22, she moved to Brazil and is now being confronted with what seems to her like a new language, although she already understands it mostly. And just for context, if you're not sure, Brazilian Portuguese and European Portuguese are really quite different languages. In fact, as a Romance linguist, I would tell you they're in many ways as different as, say, Spanish is to, well, either version of Portuguese. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Is Ana Lucia a third language learner? Okay, so now what you can have is you can have a score of 0 if you think none of these should qualify as third language learners. You can think that You have a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Maybe if you just want to use the chat function or just kind of think in your head now what your number is. So what is your number? Do you have a 7? Do you have a 6? Do you have a 5? Do you have a 4? Well, let me just tell you, because of course we don't have a live audience, and often I do this, in a live sitting, and I ask people to raise their hands. I always ask that question I asked you first before. Are we all sure that we know what a third language learner is? And of course, if we can count 1, 2, and 3, everybody in some sense knows what a third language learner is. But when I ask this question, I usually get a range from at least 7. So some people say, yeah, all of these are types of third language learners. Maybe that case of Ping relearning his third language in a more formal way and learning the formal Mandarin variety, adding to that literacy is a type of third language learning, because of course a colloquial variety that's spoken at home only is probably different than the standard variety that you get. And Masha Polinsky has a really nice paper in 2015 in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition that makes some type of argument that when heritage speakers reaffirm or come to learn their languages in a more formal setting later in age, that could potentially be viewed as a type of additive third language acquisition, much like I learned English naturalistically at home, but of course, that's not necessarily the English that I learned in school and am equally proficient in and completely unconsciously switch between. If I called my mom right now, this wouldn't be the English that you're hearing right now. So what's your number? Typically we get 7, 6, 5s, 4s. And that's something that's very interesting. So I wish that, again, we could all see each other and that you could look around the room and see that the person next to you might not have the same number as you, even though we're all interested in third languages, even though many of us probably study bilingualism and think about this, if not ourselves study third language acquisition. And if in a room of linguists, we have such different numbers, if you imagine that room that I typically have that has a range of 7 to 4, sometimes there's even an outlier saying 1 or 2 when they read these same scenarios. That's something to keep in mind when we're doing research, right? Because we represent the people who eventually will or are doing this type of research. And sometimes we have disagreements. In fact, today we're going to talk about the lay of the land in terms of theoretical models and predictions and foci that individual researchers and programs have. And maybe some of the disagreements we have is because we're not always speaking about the same people when we do the same type of research and when we use the same label. So I'm really addressing those of you out there that are perhaps younger researchers, PhD students, postdocs, and even my colleagues who are a little bit older like me and potentially a little bit older yet than me who are doing this type of research or any type of research. I could have given you the same scenarios if today I was talking about heritage speakers or second language learners or simultaneous bilinguals. If we have differences in mind when we qualify or when we're speaking about particular people from another researcher, that has empirical consequences and certainly has consequences for our agreements and especially our disagreements. We might just have different people in mind. So with that in mind, let me move forward and let's just keep pondering that. And let's talk about some things that we can agree on or agree to disagree on, okay? So first off, there is no concrete objective definition of what an L3 learner is. I'm not going to give you my number, and I'm sure some of you are going to want to ask me later, what is your number? Did you have a 7? Do you have a 6? Do you have a 5? To be honest with you, I don't know because I don't think about it. I use it as an exercise. But what I can tell you is that all of those scenarios that were explained have in some shape or form been included in articles that are out there where the claim is that this is additive acquisition of yet an additional language after bilingualism, third or more language acquisition. Even as I mentioned, that case of Ping, where it's Mandarin at home, then English, then a formal context of learning a formalized property of Mandarin. Again, as I mentioned, Masha Polinsky has a nice article, not necessarily even saying it should be, but pondering and bringing up the question that such scenarios are a case of a type of third language acquisition. Research thus far has not addressed all the possible questions that we might have pertaining to multilingualism. And that's actually good. So for those of you, again, who are interested in this, there's a lot to be done in this emerging field of third language acquisition. So there is a large field since, well, many, many decades of multilingualism and asking lots of questions, in particular, sociolinguistically relevant questions of multilingualism. But looking at acquisition proper and separating out bilinguals from multilinguals is relatively new. Okay, and something that certainly has a lot more room for innovative further research. Okay, but although we can agree on those things, we do agree, all of us agree, although we might not have the same definitions, and although we might not be asking the same questions, all of us agree, whether we're doing the sociolinguistic side or a formal linguistic understanding of the processes of acquisition and processing, we all agree that previous linguistic experience is very important, in fact, deterministic in multilingualism. Even if we don't agree exactly how that plays out, we also agree that examining how transfer obtains can inform proposals more generally in linguistic theory and also on the bridge between language and cognition, in particular cognitive economies. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about all of this for the remainder of the talk. Okay, so L3 LN matters. Hopefully you get the double entendre here. L3 LN matters. It could have two meanings, right? It could just be matters of L3, issues pertaining to L3, or I could be making a claim here with an exclamation point that L3 LN, meaning more than 3, matters. It's important. Okay. And I actually am going to do both. We're going to talk about the issues and I'm going to make the case for you that L3 acquisition really matters. Okay. As I said, there's many ways to look at multilingualism. Today, we will focus on acquisition of an additional language by people who are already bilingual at the start. So first off, I want to make an argument for you, and I hope that this is something that just makes a lot of sense. If it makes a lot of sense to you, then you should be pondered by why this isn't still to this day equally applied in L2 research. So a lot of research is done on non-native language acquisition, as of course all of you know. And often, especially up until the past decade or so, the term L2 is used often meaning anything that's not native L1 acquisition, right? So for a very long time, I had assumed when at UCLA, it was kind of hammered in us, if we're looking at second language learners, then having somebody who speaks yet another language introduces a potential confound. Not that it's not interesting to look at multilingualism, but then we shouldn't be calling it L2 acquisition. In fact, when you look at a lot of studies, so-called L2 learners are half true second language learners, monolinguals who are being studied learning Spanish. But oftentimes there's a good number of people who have yet another language before learning the language that is the target. Maybe they're heritage speakers learning what is a second language if you take the other two languages to be first languages, but chronologically is a third language. And what they will have in common is that they will have multiple competing sources of language information or grammars in the mind that can affect the process. So failing to properly differentiate true second language from what is countably 3 or more may have inadvertent damaging impact for important questions in studies in second language acquisition. Let me give you one case in point. What do we know about second language or non-native language acquisition? Variation, individual differences, right? So we can say, and we can talk about things in general. What if some of the variation that exists in so-called L2 studies is because the aggregates or the groups are actually bringing together true L2 learners and people who are transferring and have different influences because they have more than one system from which to choose, so to speak, or that can exert influence in performance on experiments, or indeed just performance in the use of the language. But in addition to that, bilinguals bring to third language acquisition or third language processing things monolinguals don't bring to L2 acquisition. So first of all, bilinguals tend to have superior metalinguistic knowledge, either self-developed metalinguistic knowledge, even people who are naturalistic learners of 2 or more languages have some type of constructed by themselves metalinguistic knowledge. How do we know this? Just many of you probably have children who are bilingual. Ask a 5-year-old and say, he speaks Korean. Oh, no, don't speak Korean to him. He speaks English. The mere fact that they know multiple languages and the existence at 2, 3, 4 years old, and that certain people should be spoken to in one code versus the other for communication purposes is something that I assure you, coming from the United States, and around me, most of the children are monolingual. They don't know what English is until much later because they don't have that need. So, and of course, second language learners are taught language and they have a different type of metalinguistic knowledge. L3 learners have access to more grammatical options, and that's something we're going to focus on for the rest of the time. So there are competing grammars, and that means potentially, insofar as they overlap and do not overlap for certain constructions and domains of grammar, they will have more options from which influence can be exercised, and that's important. And then, of course, we know that there's potential cognitive adaptations to executive functions, to language control, to executive control and attention in bilinguals. And if so, that might make bilinguals a different type of learner of an additional language. Maybe better to ignore irrelevant information, resolve conflict amongst competing alternatives, minimize costs associated with task switching, which we know is relevant within language and of course well beyond language. So those are things to keep in mind that make somebody who is already bilingual a different person or a different type of learner approaching the process and the task of learning a third language acquisition. Let's agree on some questions and we're going to pursue them further now. Okay, so what are the variables, factors involved that explain the start, the development, the use, and outcomes of multilingualism? That's the big picture. That's what the program wants to try to understand. And by the way, these are so general that we could say the same thing and just replace it with monolingualism, child L1 acquisition, bilingualism. So that's the big picture of eventually what we want to do, okay? But this is a young field, and we're not, I'm going to make the argument for you that we're not ready to tackle all of this, okay? So let's try this one. How and at what levels is multilingual acquisition different from monolingual and true bilingual acquisition? Or is it? Okay, these are again, this is a really big main question. I'm going to give you a taster for what's about to come. And I'm going to try to convince you that actually third or more language acquisition isn't any different than bilingual acquisition or monolingual acquisition. It works over the same mechanisms cognitively and linguistically, but of course on the surface it's different because the context and the variables that contribute to the start, development, use, and outcomes are multiplied more and different, but fundamentally they're the same process. I will try to convince you of that. Okay, but first we're going to narrow our focus, and I think that it's wise of the field to attempt, and I've argued this quite explicitly and iteratively so many times, that we need to narrow our focus in the beginning, and I will make that argument in many more slides to you for the rest of our talk. So here's our objectives today. And in general, for my research program on multilingualism, we want to study the role of transfer in the acquisition of a third or further language. We want to try to understand the variability as pertains to transfer selection in the field so far. And this is after more than a decade of work. So this is going to move into the kind of systematic review of the field of transfer studies in third language acquisition. And how are we going to do this? I'm going to present to you a thorough review of published studies examining transfer selection. So that is the choice of transfer coming from the first language or the second language, or in the case of simultaneous bilinguals, one or the other of their first languages, okay? And we're going to explore whether certain methodological practices can explain the variability in results across studies. Okay. So first off, as I had mentioned to you, there's been quite a bit of growth in studies in the field. Okay. And this is actually quite old because this is done in 2017. And I have to say that there's an exponential explosion almost each year of studies that look at, and now again, specifically transfer of morphosyntax in third or more language acquisition. And what you can see, and this is just things that are published in major journals, there is quite an increase just between 2004 2017. And actually, if I had the time yesterday, as I had planned to, but I didn't, to update it even further, you would see that that spike continues in an upward direction, which I think is a very good thing. Okay, so moving forward, what's the problem in a nutshell? Okay, so similarly to second language acquisition, the problem of linguistic transfer and third language acquisition can really be summarized as follows. Just like in second language acquisition, transfer is possible and even likely. I would actually have argued many times, it's a cognitive reflex, actually. Your mind is pre-wired and pre-programmed to be efficient. And efficiency is often understood on the surface in what looks like laziness, right? Why not use the experiences you have? And in this case, the experience of learning language, and specifically the mental representations of language as a hypothesis space, a specified hypothesis space that children, when they're confronted with a first language, whether a single or multiple languages, don't have a specific grammar from which to draw from. But if you do, potentially there is a pre-push for you to use at least one of them. However, unlike in second language acquisition, there's more than one possible source language. There's more than one grammar. Now, mind you, that grammar doesn't have to be perfect. It has to have a systematic level of representations. So whatever your L2 language is, and it doesn't need to be in an end state, but as long as you have an interlanguage representation, that would be available for transfer. Okay, so because of this, most of the debates around this issue have focused on the timing, the extent, and the sourcing of linguistic transfer and third language acquisition. These questions are actually interrelated, as we will see, but for the moment, I'm going to present them separately. Okay, so question one is on source. Okay, so which of the languages it comes from. Okay, so while some researchers have proposed default influence from the L2, and you can see this all schematized in the picture that's there. Just look at the picture as I kind of explain this. You're going to see that things change. Okay, so it could come from the L1, it could come from the L2 or the L1. Others have attributed selection to other factors such as maximal facilitation. For example, Flynn's model, which we'll talk about in a second, property-specific similarity, or overall structural similarity between the L3 and the two previous languages. Now, obviously, I'm here and that's me, so I'm going to try to convince you that that might be on the right track. I have to say and admit to start, I don't think the model's completely correct. How could it be? I thought of it and I developed it. And how could I possibly know all of the variables? But I think it's on the right track. And we're going to go through, again, as I mentioned, a view of a large portion of studies published through 2018. And I think that the preponderance of the evidence still leads us in the direction of overall structural similarity being the source predictor. Okay, so remember question 2 is about extent. Okay, so this is a major debate within the field. And extent refers to how much of the grammar is actually transferred at any given time. And my preoccupation has always been on the very beginning of transfer of that first interlanguage grammar. And I'm going to make in a couple slides from now an argument on why that, an epistemological argument on why that's really important. Okay, so extent of transfer in L3 acquisition is really important, and we can identify two main approaches that kind of divide the models that I will specifically go over in a couple slides. On the one hand, we have models that assume full transfer, okay? And this is in line with the well-known proposal of second language acquisition, like Schwartz and Sproul. So that's, in this case, full transfer, full access. We can leave full access, and that's referring to full access to universal grammar, to the side for a moment, because actually the proposal of full transfer is compatible with whether you take a generative perspective or even the most robust of usage-based perspectives. It's just really about copying parts of the grammar as your initial hypothesis, okay? And full transfer would say that you copy indeed the entirety of the grammar. In other words, your third language interlanguage grammar starts as a fully specified grammar, okay? Here, differences between theories have to do with the variables that are taken to condition the selection of one previous language over the other. Some argue for overall structural similarity, like my model, the typological primacy model, and others argue for activity, so recently activated or dominance being the factor, irrespective of. But the idea here for both the typological primacy model and the language of communication hypothesis is that the entire grammar is moved over, okay? I give a hierarchy, which I'll explain, and for Jabari and colleagues, this would be whatever language is most active because it's the dominant language of use. Okay. On the other hand, we have partial transfer approaches. And we have proposals that assume that transfer takes place on a property by property basis, and that would happen throughout development. So whereas the full transfer models make a claim that this happens complete grammar transferred, so a fully specified grammar, this would say that, in fact, you are much more conservative and you transfer domain by domain through the process of learning, okay? Okay, so I want to make a special note here before we continue, and this is a terminological note, but it's actually I'm talking about specifically, and maybe in a minute or two I can convince you that it's very important to make a distinction between these terms. So I can ask you, across linguistic influence, you often see this, CLI for short, and transfer synonyms. For many researchers it is, and I'm going to tell you today and refer you to my book from last year, which has 20 pages probably on the topic of why they should not be considered proper synonyms of each other, okay? So let me tell you why transfer is the underlying mental representation in the sense of a real entity being copied. It's the grammar itself. Cross-linguistic influence would be influence, just like the name suggests. And this would be much more processing based. So transfer refers to the status of the representations in the developing interlanguage itself, and cross-linguistic influence would be the contextual bleeding over, usually for processing reasons, of the other grammar, but not forming part of the interlanguage grammar itself. And hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and I think, to answer my own second question, that's how we should be viewing this. If you don't agree, that's fine, but just so you know, that's how I'm using these terms moving forward. Okay, now our third question relates to timing. Okay, so as I said before, extent and timing are at least partially related. The reason is that full transfer models envision this type of transfer as a mechanism of cognitive economy, which is meant to provide a complete hypothesis for the grammar of the L3, which of course then can be reconfigured, as it is in second language acquisition, as we process L3 input, and at least some parts of the transferred grammar are unable to parse the target properly, kind of a sink or swim approach. An interesting empirical question, of course, is how close to first exposure does this take place? And that is that big decision. There's a paper I'll give a plug for, a keynote paper coming out in Linguistic Approaches to Bilingualism I don't edit it anymore, but a journal that I had founded with some colleagues by Schwartz and Sprouse that I highly recommend and is really relevant to the discussions we're having today. It will come out in the first issue of 2021. It's a keynote, and it will be accompanied by at least 15 commentaries by people like myself and the authors of the other models. And they make similar arguments as I'm making here. An interesting empirical question, of course, is how close, as I mentioned, to first exposure this happens. And this is likely to depend on the linguistic and extra-linguistic context surrounding each specific third language acquisition situation, but we'll get to that later. An important thing to note here is that these models do not preclude instances of partial transfer later on in development. In fact, there's very nice work by some of my former students, Jennifer Cabrelli, for example, showing that recovery, and Aloy Puig-Mayenco has some really good stuff with similar vein, showing that recovery from non-facilitative transfer, which is what we call those times in which the transferred property does not match the target, very much depends on what you have available as an alternative, which would suggest that partial transfer happens down the road. Just bear that in mind as we move forward, okay? Now, I say this because it's been claimed that, in particular, the typological primacy model, which is mine, suggests or in fact has claimed that once you make a transfer, the other languages are blocked to you. Of course, that's never been said. Again, that's something in the book, because a book allows for full discussion that we discuss very straightforwardly. But of course, you have access to the other grammars, your L1 and your L2. The question is whether or not the initial grammar for the L3 was fully specified and the sourcing of where that came from. Okay. All right. So we are moving forward. Here, what we want to say is, now I want you to notice, if you are familiar with the second language acquisition literature, that this approach of partial transfer is not the same as in models in L2 acquisition, where you understand partial transfer in terms of minimal trees or valueless features or other similar proposals. Those theories of L2 acquisition claim that only parts of the L1 are transferred into the L2, but this takes place upon first exposure. So what's different here is about the timing of partial transfer. So for minimal trees, for example, for those of you who are familiar, what they claim is that you have transfer, a full transfer of lexical categories, but not functional categories, right? But that all happens at the beginning. So VP and all of its content transfers, but not CP, for example, if you understand structure in those terms, right? And of course, all the properties that would be related or lower than the verb phrase, but not things that are related higher in the left periphery, for example. Those things wouldn't transfer. But that would fully happen from the beginning. Here, just keep in mind, partial transfer means at any point in development, not in the beginning, there is a transfer of a property from one of the other source languages. It's quite difficult to tease that apart, I might add, and we'll argue moving forward, from just learning and learning by parsing in particular. Okay? All right. Okay, so again, moving on with timing of transfer, the empirical problem with transfer throughout development, as I just said, is transfer is difficult to identify unambiguously among other confounds. It can be mistaken for when facilitative or masked by when non-facilitative, the learning process, true acquisition of the L3, right? So in the sense when you have full transfer, you will get input that doesn't accord with some of the properties that you've transferred. We then have parsing failures, right? As we do in first language acquisition, if you understand grammatical development as such, and then you have learning takes place. Well, it's hard to tell what that is at later stages, okay? If 5 years after first exposure, I observe target-like knowledge of an L3 property, how do I know whether it was transferred or acquired without help? How to know when a non-target property was transferred first, then reconfigured to the right representation over time? And how do I know if I'm looking at people who have 3 years of exposure that I haven't missed something that was transferred before, or that I'm looking at a stage of acquisition where I've missed something altogether? Okay, so it's a difficult task to do. And that's why we tend to look at least within my research and my research program, we look at the beginning stages. Okay. Now, I'm just giving you a picture here, but I'm trying to make a point with that picture, okay? We tend to use this picture. I use this picture a lot of a building collapsing to make a more epistemological point, okay? If we're trying to model a developmental process, wouldn't we want to have a solid foundation? This building didn't. And the consequences are what you see in this picture. Wouldn't we want to acquire, first and foremost, a good understanding of the initial conditions before we start modeling the developmental outcomes? Just like we want to make sure the foundation of a building is solid before we get to the floors above. So just keep that in mind. That's a real preoccupation of mine and a real passion of mine. We need to get the initial language work. Or I start to invest the space and the predictions we can make moving forward. Let's go through the models in brief. You're probably well familiar with them. So the first model is the cumulative enhancement model. The cumulative enhancement model, which is by Flynn et al. Credit where it's due. This is the absolute first proper independent model of third language acquisition. And basically what it says, you can read the slide for yourself, you'll have access to them. Basically, in a nutshell, what the cumulative enhancement model says is that previously acquired languages can facilitate or remain neutral. So under the right conditions, it might allow you to skip a step in the acquisition process, but facilitation happens or there should not be any transfer effect. So positive transfer only. Okay. The L2 status factor, which is the second such model come out a couple years later. This is a really strong model, I have to say, in terms of the predictions that it makes. So it says that, just like the name suggests, there's a privileged status for the second language. It maintains that the morphosyntactic transfer is, in fact, prejudiced, if you will, to come from L2 where possible, okay? And this is based on evidence of placement of negation in V2 languages and studies. And, you know, in recent years, it offers quite a nuanced explanation, making some assumptions on how and why this would be. And the idea here is that L2, L3, and anything that's not an early acquired language when you're young has a different status in the mind and therefore more similar and thus more accessible within the memory systems for transfer. My preferred model, obviously, the typological primacy model. Basically, in a nutshell, this just says that overall structural similarity as determined by the parser across languages is ultimately the decisive factor, conditioning initial stages transfer. The underlying syntax of either the L1 or the L2 is transferred completely, so this is a full transfer account. This predicts the possibility of both facilitative and non-facilitative transfer. And predictive validity obtains when the factors that underlie how the parser determines this structure are articulated and proven tenable. And of course, as you might know, we have given a hierarchy, and I'm not going to belabor it, but basically these are meant to be an implicational hierarchy of cues that the parser is using. In addition, in very recent years, there's been some truly partial transfer, as this cumulative enhancement model is the partial transfer model. We have Slabakova scalpel model and the linguistic proximity model. And basically, these are almost kind of amalgamations between the typological primacy model. They both agree that typological primacy and underlying structure is ultimately what determines the selection of transfer. But differently from the typological primacy model, they strongly advocate transfer property by property throughout development. So no big decision of a complete specification to be transferred in the beginning. You use the same type of mechanisms as I've argued previously, but you do it throughout development and you're conservative and you don't transfer everything all at once. Okay, in the remainder of the talk, I'm now just going to go through what the research in its aggregate tells us. And as I mentioned you. I guess these are kind of shameless plugs, but actually, because, obviously reading it for yourselves might be somewhat helpful. In actually this year, we have a systematic review of transfer studies and third language acquisition came out in the journal Second Language Research. So you have it there. And then, of course, we have, although ironically in 2019, a bigger version of this came out. And the reason being, you know how publishing works. The article was accepted in 2018, and the book coming out in 2019 includes even more studies than what I'm going to show you today. So if you want the most updated version, you actually want to go to the book in 2019, which added many more studies. And of course, has the space to discuss this more than 10,000 word limit. There's an entire chapter that goes through what I'm about to show you in much more detail. But both of those are two resources you might want to look at. But I'm going to summarize what they say for you. Okay, so here's our research questions. Do currently available studies rigorously control relevant in determining language acquisition? Are there specific methodologies and practices that may bias the results towards one model or another? So how did we do this? Okay, first of all, what I'm going to show you today is a retrieval of studies that was done in March of 2018. This represents what's in the Second Language Research article. As I mentioned, there are more studies included in the 2019 book. Here's how we did the search. We looked through Google Scholars, ProQuest, and LLBA, and we did key searches for third language, multilingualism, so on and so forth, to determine that. Of course, we read the studies to determine which would contain. They had to meet one or more of the following criteria: focus on transfer of third language acquisition, focus on testing specifically the models that were available at the time they were published, and focus on modeling L3 LN acquisition. And almost in all cases, they did all three. Okay, so there were 64 independent studies included, but oftentimes studies have multiple experiments in them. So we actually coded things by experiment, and that's 92 experiments. Okay, so just keep that in mind, which is pretty large cohort to look at. Okay, so we did some coding. We coded for two types of variables, and these relate to our two research questions. We have macro variables, and these were used to distinguish the models from each other to the extent possible, using the different factors that each model proposes is deterministic for selection. And then to a lesser extent, the differences in the type of outcomes they predict. Typological transfer was defined for each case, applying the TPM's hierarchy that I had showed you before. Hybrid transfer can mean two things here, okay, as we've coded it. Either the study looked at more than one property, and these show different sources of transfer, or they just looked at one property, and this seems to show combined influence from both previous languages at the same time. Everything here is binary, and this is for statistical reasons. Note that you can get a positive valuation for more than one of these, depending on the design of the study. We were trying to be maximally open and fair in capturing compatibility, not unambiguous support, right? So something can be compatible with more than one thing at the same time. Okay. And these are the methodological practices, so proficiency. Now, if you remember the brief summary of the theories a few minutes ago, not all are equally set to model transfer throughout L3 development. The TPM, for example, attempts to model a single instance of full transfer at the initial stages. This doesn't mean that we're the only one, that it's the only one we care about, or rather should care about. Given that the scope of the TPM, the most restrictive model in this sense, is most relevant to the initial stages, we use two levels in coding for this factor: beginners and not beginners. So if the study was looking at people who were beginners and true beginners of the language, or they were 2, 3, 4 years into it at various levels of proficiency, which for our purposes captures the necessary distinction. Languages tested, this is really a question of baselines. If you show L1 transfer in L3, but have not tested the L2, it is impossible to know if the property has indeed been transferred from the L1 or from the L2, which itself had transferred from the L1. Does this make sense? I hope that it does. So we're coding whether or not studies tested the learner, the individual learner's knowledge of the particular domain in the L1 and the L2, so that we know that those participants have different source representations potentially for transfer, or potentially some of the L2 learners haven't acquired the property and their L2 looks like the L1, even though in principle, the languages would be different. We just, in other words, don't assume that they have the descriptive knowledge of the two grammars. We want to know what their actual knowledge is, what their sources of transfer are actually. Mirror image groups are here in which the L3 is the same, but the order of the L1 is simply reversed. And we've made arguments in many papers that when possible, and we recognize that it's not always possible, but when possible, that creates a really good control. So to just give you an example, L1 Spanish, L2 English, L3 Portuguese, you keep Portuguese the same, and now you do L1 English, L2 Spanish, okay? And look at the source language. That'll give us a really good way to know if language status, if the L1 always transfers to the L2, because then the groups should be different, shouldn't they? Because they will have different L1s and L2s. Okay, all right, so let's move forward and see what we see. Okay, so quick overview of the studies supported for each macro variable. Two important things to say here. We have clear support for non-facilitative transfer. I'm just going to actually pull up all of these things now, okay? We have clear support for non-facilitative transfer and typological transfer, okay? Look at the numbers, right? But what you can actually see here is that there is no unambiguous support, but rather compatibility with a certain variable or outcome, and not all the studies show complete support. So I guess in an ideal world, you would like to have 92 out of 92. But what stands out is that there's a lot of support. 59 out of 92 experiments seem to be very clearly explainable on typological similarity. And of course, we have a lot of non-facilitation. Now, one note here, we test on purpose for the potential of non-facilitation because it's one way to actually determine if something has been transferred. If something is simply facilitative, it could also just be acquired, couldn't it? But if something is non-facilitative, it wouldn't be part of the space from the input that could have been acquired. So we tend to look for that to see if it happens, okay? But again, remember, the cumulative enhancement model suggests that you shouldn't see that at all. Okay, so now this is just another way of visualizing things, okay? And again, you can find this in the two references I referred to. The numbers in the white box represent the number of studies previously marked for a macro variable, what you just saw. And then you have the models that go with each factor. Note that we could not combine here the results for non-facilitative transfer. And the reason is that you have transfer source here, and then you have transfer type. They're actually different types of variables. So I'll show you that separately, okay? Okay, so this is another way so now we've removed here the 10 studies that were not possibly marked for non-facilitation, and this allows us to see evidence against the CEM, okay? So again, remember, the CEM had predicted that you would never, or you shouldn't have a lot of non-facilitation. And as we can see, again, remember, let's be fair, that was proposed as the very first study in the very first model. Well, 15 years later, a plurality of studies show that that suggestion and that hypothesis, tenable and theoretically tenable as it was, just doesn't come to bear. So we seem to have a lot of evidence against it. What I'm going to do now, we're approaching being done actually, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack these macro variables for you, okay, case by case, because we want to understand, why is it the case that we don't have unambiguous support? And again, because we have similar suggestions. So take, for example, typological transfer, removing the 10 that were non-facilitated, we're left with 51. That's compatible with 3 models, the TPM, the linguistic proximity model, and the scalpel model. And the reason is because they all purport that as a factor. So let's try to unpack some of the macro variables to see why some of these other studies potentially didn't show one or the other effect, okay? So let's look at this one. And this is studies now. We're going to look at the subset of studies that show only L1 transfer, okay? And we went through subset by subset. We tried to see what methodological factors seem to be particularly relevant within the subset of studies showing compatibility with a given macro variable, here L1 transfer only. We conducted a battery of Fisher's exact tests to probe for categorical associations. This test is more conservative than the traditional chi-square, and it's used when there are cells with low numbers of counts. So that's why we did this. And what you can see is that the only variable is production versus comprehension. So you are much more likely in production to show L1 transfer, to show L1 transfer effects. Now, remember that that's not necessarily incompatible with that also being typologically determined, but it's something to keep in mind. So again, here we have proficiency, testing beyond the L3, the genetic relationships of the languages, mirror image, whether they use that or not, or whether the method was production or comprehension. Production seemed to prejudice that. Okay, so now looking at studies, the subset of studies that had L2 transfer only, for this subset, we got two statistically significant associations. Methodology. Out of the studies showing L3 transfer, production data are significantly associated with production versus comprehension, okay? Something to keep in mind. So one method seems to prejudice that. And there are reasons of accessibility, right? If in production that make production and comprehension different. And mirror image came out. But in this case, it's the lack of using a mirror image and L2 transfer that are associated with each other. Okay, moving forward, let me just make sure I'm on the right cursor. Okay, typological transfer. So now we're looking at a very large cohort. Remember, 59 out of 92 studies show typological transfer. What were the practices that methodological choice that prejudiced, if you will, well, maybe not prejudiced, but tended to see this, okay? And we have two that come up. Okay, and the two that come up are using of a mirror image, of a mirror image method and genetic relationships. So it seems to be that when you properly control for directionality, you're much more likely to capture this typological relationship of determinacy. And then also, and not surprisingly, the genetic relationship of the language. So the more closely related the languages, the more likely you were to see typological transfer. That's kind of a no-brainer to be predicted. What about hybrid transfer? Okay, remember hybrid transfer can be of two types. It could be that you had two experiments testing different domains of grammar and evidence that one of the domains comes from the L1 and one from the L2 or vice versa, or some suggestion of amalgamated both the L1 and the L2 or simultaneously somehow transferring. Here again, we get two positive associations. And here it is in terms of methodology, production and hybrid transfer are associated. And you can imagine the costs, and we know that languages are simultaneously activated. So maybe there's something about the modality of production that creates things coming in and out, what I would now refer back to as cross-linguistic influence, as opposed to capturing transfer proper, which I think, and I've maintained for a long time, is better done with comprehension. And of course, the lack, again, of having that proper control with a mirror image to control for directionality positively correlates with showing high. The last thing is non-facilitative transfer. There are no significant correlations. Oh, let me go back to that. There are no significant correlations. And what this means is that it doesn't matter what you do, non-facilitation is shown. And so that means that it's just really robust and non-facilitation happens. But potentially, and I think probably this means the days of the cumulative enhancement model are really numbered. Okay, so now more we're inching towards finishing, and let me give you a recap. Okay, so comprehension versus production data. Okay, so if you apply that methodology, L2 transfer and hybrid transfer studies are significantly more often production studies. So there might be something that in the methodology that gives rise not for transfer to happen there, but to make it seem like transfer is there, because you're using different resources when you have to produce something that might be more susceptible to momentary bleeding in, as opposed to capturing a representation of the underlying grammar. The opposite is true of L1 transfer compatible studies. Testing the same property in all languages Studies compatible with L2 transfer tend not to do this, okay? And that's kind of important to keep in mind. And we want to know what is actually available in the two languages for the individual, because we're talking about individuals. Individuals make up aggregates, right? Genetic relatedness, significant with typological transfer subset, that's not surprising. And the use of mirror image methodology, where we can really control for directionality. Studies are associated with L2 and hybrid transfer tend not to have that mirror image. And maybe what that's saying is that when you're showing hybrid transfer in L2, it might be a consequence of you not having a proper control, okay? Or making grander conclusions than you might be able to without controlling for directionality, okay? Order of acquisition cannot by itself account for the mass majority of the data. If it explains sets of data, the lack of mirror image group comprises unambiguous support. The take-home point is modality matters. Typological transfer has large explanatory power, okay? The largest explanatory power. And it might be that it has even much larger explanatory power were it not for many of the confounds that we coded as methodological variables that seemingly correlate with a particular outcome, suggesting they might be distracting factors in terms of what the data is actually showing, okay? Hybrid transfer is found in a small portion of studies. The nature of production data, again, might be responsible for this. There is conclusive evidence for non-facilitative transfer, so maybe the CEM is done, as we said. What about full transfer versus partial transfer? We actually need studies specifically designed to test this and how, and I think in recent times we're doing this, okay? One of the ways we can do this is even though data coming from different studies testing the same languages show that transfer almost always come from Spanish, for example, in English, Spanish, then Brazilian Portuguese, we have to keep in mind that we understand things and we should understand things in a theoretical sense incrementally. We all like to publish, right? So, you know, we might even be testing multiple domains of grammar and publishing things in different studies. But the idea of accumulating evidence is actually wrong. Okay? So certain variables have more predictive power than others. Variability needed to avoid possible conflict. L3 research makes significant contributions to language science, especially adding to our understanding of the composition of mental representations of language, interface of cognition and language acquisition, and how language is acquired more generally. Data from L3 studies highlight core principles of linguistics and cognition more generally. Economy. This is all about economy, doing the least amount for the maximum benefit. For more reasons, but particularly to the extent that we're interested in the role of previously acquired languages, third language acquisition must not be mistaken as just another case of bilingualism or just non-native acquisition. It's special and it can show us special things. A systematic review of the field so far reveals that typological proximity must be taken into account. You don't think it's completely deterministic, that's fine. I'm not so sure that it is myself, but I think that it clearly has been shown to be an important thing to take into account for transfer selection. Some of the variability found across studies in our systematic review might be explained by methodological differences. Not many studies test truly ab initio learners. Only 42 of 92 experiments reviewed even used beginning learners with different amounts of exposure. And we're trying to understand the foundation of that building, remember? So that's also another factor. Bottom line, and I'm done, all acquisition is potentially the same. Multilingualism simply opens up possibilities to see different traces or surface manifestations of essentially the same processes and universal guiding principles. And last shameless plug, because I mentioned it a couple times, all of this is in a book that you can get and gives you the context, over 300 pages of it, for you to fully understand and join us in this venture to study third language acquisition. I'd really like to thank two colleagues in particular, but really everybody who works in my lab, which is a virtual army of wonderful people who make me look good all the time. But in particular, these two, Jorge González Alonso and Alonso Puig-Mayenco, who in the most current sense have been my partners in crime and third language acquisition, but of course, many other students and current ones who are working on this as well. And with that, I want to thank you again for your attention, and I open it up to questions now.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kim Gi-taek,
Yes.
could you clarify your question for us, please?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. So my name is Gi-taek Kim, and I like your presentation. So I have two questions for you. So the first question is as follows. So my first question is the parser strategy to identify or find the similar grammar between L1 and L2. So as far as I know, you in your previous studies, you claimed that the parser looked at the lexicon first, and then phonology, then morphology, and then finally syntax. However, my question is that, what is the theoretical motivation for your claim? That is, what is the theoretical reason for the sequence from the lexicon to the syntax? So that is my first question. So after I have your answer, so I will keep going on to my second question.
Okay, thanks for that question. I really appreciate that question. I think, you know, one thing to be said is that, you know, as we all know, because we all publish, right, that we're limited by space when we write articles, right? And that's quite unfortunate. And I have to say, I don't know that I will write another book because it's quite the task to do it, especially when you're juggling things. But why I wrote the book is because I had as much pages and as much space as I wanted to really motivate. So I'm going to give you a relatively short answer, but again, not because we're trying to sell the book. I'd probably get in trouble, but I can share my personal copy with you if you'd like for you to read it. There's 50 pages that answers your question here, okay? But let me try to do this. And I think even in the original articles that do it, there's some motivation that's there. The idea here is that you're parsing for meaning first. So there's two motivations underlying the drive to do this, and then the linguistic side of it. So the first is the drive. And so I argue that it's a cognitive stipulation of economy that you want to have as much of a hypothesis, a specific hypothesis space as early on as possible. So you need to get there. The hierarchy is proposed as such. We're adults and we have experience with language. We know that the basic units of language in terms of parsing for meaning is the lexicon. And especially if something overlaps, we grab onto it. I've lived in Norway now for about 1.5 years. And my favorite thing is when I can pick up on the couple words that I can identify as being similar to English, and then I construct a meaning from there. And I realize now, as I'm learning more of the language, some of what I'm constructing is on the right target and some of it is not, even if I have some of the words. So I think that we can latch on, especially as adults, we can latch on to trying to parse for meaning from the semantics that are encoded in the words. But what if you have languages? We want a hypothesis that can work for all language combinations, and a parser that doesn't know what Korean is from Japanese, from Chinese, from Spanish, from whatever. We know these things as social constructs and descriptive things that exist, of course, but your parser just knows system one, another system, and it's streaming to try to do what it's programmed to do for language. Then the hierarchy, if that is irrelevant, let's say that you're dealing with two scenarios. Either the L1 and the L2 are equally similar to the L3, and you really at the lexical level, and you can't really make a decision. That can happen a lot if you have 3 Germanic languages. Why would Dutch be more than German or German more than Dutch if English is the target or something like that, okay? Just at the lexical level, right? It could also happen when the two languages, when the two languages have nothing to do, equally nothing to do at the lexical level, right? So then the idea is that this is an implicational hierarchy. The idea is that you don't even use phonology if you get enough input from the lexicon, boom, you make the decision, you transfer, so that you have the early hypotheses to start to parse and use the grammar as the parser. So it should be said that I am part of many people, although not universally agreed, that the grammar is the parser itself, right? So we need a grammar to parse, and that's another reason for transfer. Then phonology, it goes phonology to morphological structure to syntactic structure, based on how the observation of how children, what are the basic, the smallest units of language that get incrementally built. And of course, we also see that this is how children kind of break into language as well. Now, I do discuss in the book, and even in the 2015 paper that introduced the hierarchy, I do discuss that I'm not 100% committed. So for example, I think there might be certain parts of these domains that actually can be used earlier. So let me give you an example. I think potentially, if something is really obvious for basic word order differences or similarities between a language, that something like that from syntax proper would be a good candidate to be used if you have to go to that. Let's say it's a V2 structure or whatever. Potentially that might be used outside of the hierarchy, but that's the basic logic behind the hierarchy. That answers the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, my second question is as follows. So as you might all know, so in L2 literature, it has been noted that the proficiency plays an important role in L2 acquisition. So actually, it is the factor that many scholars, including Bonnie D. Schwartz that you mentioned in your talk, has emphasized so far. So I wonder whether there is a possibility that proficiency of L1 versus L2 plays a role in L3 transfer. For example, if L2 is more proficient than L1, like heritage speakers, so in heritage language acquisition, L2 is more proficient than L1. So can it be possible that the parser selects L2? Or if L1 is more proficient than L2, can it be possible that the parser selects L1 because it is more proficient language? So I wonder whether there is any particular hypothesis espousing this possibility, or what do you think about this possibility?
Okay, also, thanks for the question. And again, I keep saying this, I guess I really want all of Korea to buy this book because we actually address it. So the fact that you're asking these questions means that it was good that we talked about it, and it's parts within the book. I will say to you a couple things. The first is that I posed this question in the 2015 paper in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition that presents the hierarchy itself. I asked, might it be different? Because one thing to keep in mind is that effectively all of the models that existed before 2017, so that is with the exception of the newer models, the linguistic model, the scalpel model, all of the language in the model, true second language learners who are non-native, who've acquired an L2, now acquiring yet another language in L3. Now, I originally conceived of the TPM in those terms as well, but it doesn't need to be understood just in those terms. Now, you might notice that the L2 status factor does need to be understood in those terms because there has to be actually an L2. For the TPM, it could just be competing systems, and that equally applies to simultaneous bilinguals, to heritage speakers. There are a couple studies that offer empirical evidence towards your question, and I want to mention them to you so that you can look at them yourself. So Holger Hopp has a really interesting paper that I think came out originally in 2018, but it might actually be published in 2019 in the International Journal of Bilingualism that tries to apply these models to heritage speakers of Turkish in a German context learning English as an L3. And it's a really, really well controlled and really well done study. And they show that typological primacy, as the TPM defines it, seems to be explanatory in that context, okay? Some work from my lab, in particular work done by Puig-Mayenco, so Aloy Puig-Mayenco, looking at what we have referred to as a very specific subtype of heritage speakers. So Spanish L1 home speakers in Catalonia, where the dominant immediate societal language. So this is also not Barcelona, where it's very bilingual, but in where Aloy himself is from, where Catalan really prevails. And basically what you see is that, again, typology and not necessarily dominance determines the transfer source. So there is some empirical evidence, but I want to challenge a couple things. You might know that I work not just on third language acquisition, but I think I've also made some significant contributions to heritage speakers, and you bring them up in particular. And I also work on just the cognitive, the links of domain general cognition as a secondary effect of bilingualism itself. Okay. And so one thing that I really think is worth challenging is the notion of what proficiency means. In fact, if you want, I'll give a plug for a talk I'm going to give in June. So forward at the International Symposium of Psycholinguistics. I'll give a keynote address there, and I'm going to talk about these issues, and this one in particular, the notion of proficiency and its determinacy, right? So you said something that heritage speakers are more proficient in their L2. I don't think that that's accurate all the time. And yeah, I agree. Think that it's accurate, period, because proficiency is determined on convergence towards a standard. So what is true to say is that heritage speakers almost always control the register systems of the dominant language in which they were educated, which tends to be an L2, and therefore can perform on an Oxford quick placement test or a TOEFL or whatever in a way that's more normative in that language than the language that they are fluent in. So if you know my work on heritage language, you will know that I am almost to the point of personally offended, although not really, this is just research. I really detest the term incomplete acquisition because they have complete systems. It's just not the educated standard variety, because that's not what they were necessarily exposed to. And typically they don't have education in the variety. So when you think in these types of terms, why should it matter? Why should that matter at all? At the end of the day, you have two systems from which to choose. Your brain does not know proficiency in linguistic terms. It knows in linguistically descriptive terms, I should say. Your brain doesn't know that your Korean is better than people who are from a particular town because that's a sociolinguistic judgment anyway. Your brain knows that you have this system and this system, potentially multiple systems for your Korean because you have different registers, different ways and stylistics of speaking with people. That maybe heritage speakers only have the lower register of informality because that's what they were exposed to. But the idea here is that your parser has sources. Why would it choose one simply because it's more proficient when proficiency really just means closer to a standard that is not a real linguistic or an intuitive notion, but something that's strapped on top of it? So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you very much.
As a moderator, I think I have to select several questions. So Professor Kim Ji-young, hold on your question for a while. And Professor Jo Gyu-hee, Dr. Jo Gyu-hee, okay, he's asking about.
Yes, that's me. And thank you for your very interesting talk today, Professor Rothman. And thank you for taking my question, Professor An. And my name is Joe, by the way, and a teacher and a researcher here in South Korea, of course. And my question regarding your intriguing talk today is about the age factor that also may constrain a selectivity of grammar between L1 and L2 in L3 acquisition. So are there any particular L3 acquisition models with higher predictive power on younger, maybe before puberty, L3 learners? If not, do you have any specific view of young learners' L3 acquisition? That is my question.
Yeah, thank you. That's really an excellent question. As I think I mentioned before, most of the models are really predicated on kind of understanding third as the least complicated case. So it's very easy, I think, to say, you know, an adult second language learner, when they learn another language, that's third language. It's more difficult to convince people about early learners because some people take exception to, well, they're not a second language learner. How could you be a third language learner if you're not a second language learner? Well, you can just do so chronologically. If you have two other systems, then you're acquiring a third without any evaluation of whether or not you have two first languages, but chronologically you're a third. Okay, so the truth of the matter is that there is a dearth, there's a lack of studies in terms of high power and number. I mentioned a couple to you. So Holger Hopp's study. I mentioned Aloy Puig-Mayenco studies. Even the study done by Marit Vestergaard and her colleagues that give rise to the linguistic proximity model is looking at early simultaneous bilinguals, but the adult-ish outcomes of them. So if we're talking about studies that actually look at child simultaneous bilinguals learning a chronological third language, still in childhood when they're tested, there are very few studies, because even the Puig-Mayenco studies and cohort of studies is looking at simultaneous bilinguals, but as their adult outcomes, and they're learning the third language. So the truth is that as an empirical truism, we don't have more than Holger and probably some other data that immediately is escaping me, but a handful of studies at most to really speak to the question of what happens. Might it be different? Not least because children, depending on the age you're capturing them, are still in development of certain parts of the language. How does that affect? Might even acquiring a third language affect how the first and the second language comes out depending on the age? We don't know the answer to these questions. However, you asked for my insight. I'm not so sure that I think that it would matter much. And one of the things that I think I ended by saying, I think it was even the last slide, is I'm a fundamental believer until evidence proves otherwise, and then I'll be happy to move this aside. I really do believe that acquisition happens working over the same mechanisms. I think that everybody has access to the same mechanisms throughout the lifespan, but all the other variables that are very difficult to tease apart as our brain matures, as we accrue experience, and we also know experience affects brain structure and function, these same mechanisms will give rise to surface differences. And so to hold true to that, I guess my null hypothesis would be that age alone as a factor will not matter, but the surface manifestations of how age interacts with different types of experiences may give rise to it looking a little bit different. But the truth is that I hope that you guys will do some studies, but this is something that we really don't know the answer to.
Okay, thank you. We should research more then. Thank you for your answer.
Okay, and maybe next question might be about whole transfer against maybe partial transfer. Dr. Kui Mao, she asked about the questions.
Hi.
Yep.
Hi, Professor Rothman. Hi, Professor An. This is Mao Cui in China. And yeah, I'm asking about the question concerning the discrimination of those models. So when we are talking about typological similarity, are we concerned with the specific linguistic phenomenon under discussion, or are we taking the languages as a whole? For example, if we are examining the L3 acquisition of relative clause with like Chinese L1, English L2, and the French L3 learners. So if we find kind of positive non-facilitative evidence for L2 English transfer, and can we incorporate the finding into TPM or LPM? Or if we look into another linguistic phenomenon like the definite article or the acquisition of reflexives, they may have different degrees of similarities or differences between these languages. So yeah, what I'm asking about is, yeah, either we take the language and the discussion as a whole, or we are looking into the specific linguistic phenomenon. Thank you.
Wonderful question, and thank you for the opportunity it provides me to make that very clear, at least to this audience. The answer to your question is, it really depends on the model. So actually, it's one of the things that differentiate the models themselves. It's actually probably the most important thing that differentiates the model. So speaking first for myself, for the typological primacy model, the whole notion here is a holistic view. The parser is searching for, to be able to make a decision. Again, a plug now for somebody else, for the Schwartz and Sprouse keynote that's coming out in Linguistic Approaches of Bilingualism in January or February of 2021. And there'll be all these commentaries. I'm going to use their term, the big decision. Saying decision makes it almost seem like it's conscious. It's the parser's big decision that's completely unconscious to us. But the idea here of the TPM is that you're looking for, as early as possible. And if the languages are very similar, it could be minutes or hours, as opposed to if the languages are very dissimilar and you have to go through the entire hierarchy, take quite a bit of time. But at the earliest possible moment, it's looking for a holistic picture. And again, as described, first the lexicon, then phonology, functional morphology, and syntax to get enough information to say, good investment. We all know, if we played in the stock market, that sometimes we have enough information and it doesn't always work and we lose money sometimes, right? So that's going to happen, but it's about overall. Conversely, for the linguistic proximity model, and indeed the scalpel model, which are very similar and just have some differences to each other, but very similar. Now it's about the domain itself. So how do articles work? How does aspect work? How does modality work? What are the projections and the structure of each property, domain by domain? In that sense, as I've referred to it, it's a very conservative approach to transfer, because instead of making a big decision, they would say, there is no big decision. You make multiple smaller yet important decisions as you move forward, okay? So what we eventually want then are studies that can speak to this potentially by testing multiple domains of grammar and seeing, do we get a holistic effect? After enough exposure, do we see, if we test articles and we test, things that are logical to put together and we can empirically put together, do we see that there is this cascading effect of a big decision? Or do we see that there are multiple decisions to be made because they decide it for one domain, but not the other, and so on and so forth? And what would be very nice is if we can also then do that kind of developmentally, because again, the LPM, or property by property models that have this conservative transfer are really theories about development as much as they are about the beginning. The beginning, basically what they're going to say is that you're only going to transfer that which is processable in the beginning. And that's going to be a limited set of properties. And then you should see it over time. Whereas after a decision can be made, after a small amount of time, you should be able to, with enough vocabulary, demonstrate an effect across the board, right? Now that makes it difficult to test because also they don't necessarily speak the third language. So comprehension becomes more important. And of course, in my research, we play to our advantage with either typologically similar languages, or over the past couple of years, we've been doing artificial third language learning and play, because then we can control all the variables, the input, the quantity, the qualities, the timing, the training. And we've been combining this over the past couple of years with looking at neurological indices. So if you're interested in that and looking at that, we had a paper that was published, I think 2 or 3 months ago in the journal Neurolinguistics, where you could actually see how the results come out. And they're quite ambiguous, but we think we have a good story for them. But you can see kind of the neurological indices seem to indicate an effect of typology in terms of focalizing the attention through learning artificial grammars. But then it's artificial, right? But we have to be able to control. So it's always the question of how you test these great theories, especially in third language acquisition, where finding and sourcing people with the right combinations, with the right amount of exposure to actually test the theories is not so simple. But really great question, and I hope that clarified it.
Okay, since we are almost out of time, but we started 5 minutes late, so we're going to have 5 more minute discussion. And I want you to ask my question first, very briefly, and then we'll move on to oral question by Jiyoung Shim, okay? So my question is, do you have a formal method to tease apart the status of transfer against CLI, cross-linguistic influence. So what kind of data may support, okay, either of them empirically or theoretically?
Okay, so I think that there's two ways to try to do this. I think that there's a behavioral observation that could indicate something is CLI versus transfer. And one of those things would be consistency, right? So if you expect something to be actual transfer, you would expect there to be relative consistency. So if the lack of articles is really something that is transferred as an initial hypothesis, then you might expect not that it's 10% or 15% dropped, because you can even find that in native speakers depending on processing burdens and whatever, but you would expect it to be something that's more consistent. So something that bleeds over, you would expect less consistency, and you would expect that consistency to be malleable to a processing burden. So empirically, if you can introduce more of a processing burden, you would expect this to fluctuate and control the fluctuation. Those are two ways to do it. The third way, and it's my preferred way of doing things now, because I do a lot of neurologically based research, is to look at involuntary things and not just depend on behavior, right? You can do this with eye tracking as well. You could do it with reaction time. My preferred method is looking at brain indices. So, and because there's qualitative differences, right? So if we're looking at something that, say, is a matching of a pattern, we might expect a different brain signature, maybe a negativity and somewhat earlier than if something is aligned with a failed expectation and a repair that has to happen, and that we would expect a positivity and a little later, like a P600 or a P600 type of thing. So I think that you can do these things and you can start to tease these things apart.
Good. It's a long answer, but it's a good answer. Thank you. And Jiyoung Shim, are you still here with us?
Yes, I'm here. I will just ask a quick question, one question. Hi, Jason. My
Hello.
question is the following. Hi, sorry, I'm not showing my face. So I'm just wondering, I'm sort of how can I say that? I'm assuming some sort of situation. Just imagine that like your L1 is Arabic and then your L2 is English, whatever. But then you're learning. So one speaker is learning Hebrew, which is similar to Arabic, and another like speaker learning Korean, which is unrelated to any of these languages. So my question is the following. So in this case, would you predict that for the Hebrew learning speaker, still your typological primacy model would work that because of the overall structural similarity? But as for the Korean learner, because there's nothing you can do. So is it this, would you predict that we do some sort of other transfers like hybrid or even partial or anything? Would it be different? Our brain is sort of structures that way?
No, and the reason, no, I don't think, I think that the typological primacy model, the hierarchy works no matter what, because they're at some level of representation, all languages have similarities, right? So the scenario that you just gave, there will be something eventually. It's not going to be the lexicon, right? It's not potentially going to be phonology, although I might be embarrassing myself because I don't know much about the phonology. I do know quite a bit about the phonology of Arabic. We have a big project, European Union project funded on looking at refugee heritage language, and that is involving quite a bit of Arabic, but I don't know much at all about Korean phonology, so I won't embarrass myself. But there is and it could be at various levels, right? So it could be whether you're talking about super segmental phonology, whether you're talking about the syllable timing of the language, the vowel inventory, the whatever. There will be something that will be more similar, and your parser is a machine. Literally, your brain is built as a statistical analyzer, and whether or not it's intuitive to you, because Korean is really, a very typologically, genetically speaking, different language, there is going to be something that will determine whether Arabic or English, I can't remember which languages you said, is a better bet to start the hypothesis. That means that the TPM, which could be completely wrong, by the way, is always a model that can make a prediction. However, it means that you really need to know a lot about linguistic structure of the two languages and or be working with some pretty cool phonologists, morphologists, and syntacticians who can help you to make an argument, typologists who can help you make an argument for where along this hierarchy, what's relevant and what's irrelevant, and how you would make that decision. But it doesn't have to be intuitive to us, because remember, all of this is at the level of the underlying parser system, which is a statistical machine of such a type that we don't have computers that even remotely come to the computational capacity yet, I should say, of the human brain, right? So that would be my answer to that, that there is and there will be something.
Oh, I like that idea, by the way. Okay, yes, okay, thank you.
See, great talk and great discussion. So we thank Jason for all this. Okay, so please give your applause. Okay, silence, of course. Yeah. So, okay, very good. So this is the end of the colloquium, and I have a very quick announcement to make concerning this L3 acquisition. We are planning to set up a kind of special issue on third language acquisition in the journal Languages. It's MDPI online journal, we're gonna make a call for paper announcement from the journal very soon. So please submit your work on your future work on L3 acquisition, as many as possible, to us. And we are also planning to organize a series of L3 seminar in the near future in connection to that call for paper too. So we want kind of booster this L3 community in Korea or in Asian countries, okay, from this. So I'm the guest editor of that special volume, and Professor Ki-taek Kim here and Kyu-hee Cho and Kyu-hee Mao are all our co-editors. Jason, hopefully, okay, in your society, okay, if you guys have any upcoming, okay, work in progress work, then please help us to have this, the special volumes for our future.
Yeah, I could also say to you too, if the world permits this, I was supposed to be in Japan for a month teaching last year, and it didn't happen, but I'm supposed to go in May, and if I don't go in May, we'll postpone it again. So maybe in connection to what you guys will be doing around this, I will be in Asia for an extended period of time, if not in May of this year, obviously given COVID, then soon after, and it would be great to maybe even in live person come and see you all and discuss more L3 stuff. So that would be great.
That would be great. So everybody stay tuned, okay, for this L3, okay? Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you very much for coming.